In a French village, the female writer Sandra is being interviewed by a female university student. Sandra's works are almost always based on her real-life experiences, skillfully blending fiction with reality. Known for her nuanced emotional descriptions and a touch of melancholy and triumph, the university student has many questions for her, but before she can ask more, the noisy sounds of music from the attic interrupt them, growing louder over time. This is the voice of Sandra's husband, Samuel. Sandra is forced to interrupt the conversation. Shortly after the female student leaves, Daniel, their son returning from walking the dog, discovers that his father has been brutally killed at the doorstep. The police quickly arrive at the scene, and after forensic examination, the cause of death is identified as head trauma. There are two possibilities for how the head trauma occurred. One is accidental fall leading to impact with a blunt object, and the other is intentional murder, with someone violently striking the victim's head and creating the appearance of suicide. To uncover the truth, further investigation and evidence collection are required. After the police leave, Sandra promptly contacts a friend who is a lawyer. After discussing the situation, the lawyer finds the accidental fall scenario less convincing, given the height of the building, and suggests that intentional murder is strongly suspected, especially since there is no DNA or blood traces on the small shed next to the victim's body where the fatal impact supposedly occurred. But Sandra insists it's impossible. Samuel has never had any conflicts with anyone, and the area is sparsely populated, with only their household nearby. However, if accidental fall and homicide are ruled out, Samuel's death would have to be considered a suicide. Yet, Sandra doesn't believe it's suicide because their son was nearby at the time, and her husband wouldn't have disregarded their son's feelings. The lawyer is in a dilemma. He can't possibly claim that Sandra killed her husband, even though the police are likely to suspect her. So, the lawyer urges Sandra not to deliberately conceal anything. His primary suggestion is to argue for suicide, as she has a new bruise on her forearm that looks like it resulted from a struggle. Sandra quickly explains that it was an accidental hit in the kitchen. After several hours of careful consideration, Sandra calls the lawyer again, suddenly remembering something and thinking that her husband might genuinely have had suicidal tendencies. About 6 months ago, she found Samuel intoxicated and vomiting on the floor, with many small white pieces resembling aspirin in the vomit. Looking back, it might have been the first attempted suicide. The lawyer is delighted to receive this information, finally having a direction for reasoning. However, the prosecution has already found enough evidence to press charges. The police, through detailed investigation, discovered a recording of a marital dispute on Samuel's USB drive, dating back to the day before his death. With this discovery, Sandra goes from being a witness to a suspect, and the prosecution files charges against her. The lawyer is furious because now there's a case against her, and Sandra's sudden change in status has left him fuming. Such an important argument, and Sandra didn't inform him in advance. Sandra, genuinely not expecting the argument to be recorded and certainly not anticipating that a seemingly ordinary marital quarrel would become evidence against her. The recorded conversation cannot truly represent the actual state of their marriage. The lawyer tells Sandra to stop because the truth is irrelevant. In court, it's about how others perceive you. To build a better defense, the lawyer asks Sandra to share all their past experiences without reservation. Sandra realizes the importance this time, and firstly, their financial situation is extremely dire. Sandra had to mortgage the house to obtain enough bail money, but there was a time when their financial situation was good. The two met in London when Samuel had just started teaching at the university, full of talent and charm. Sandra was captivated at first sight. Moreover, both shared similar aspirations, as Samuel secretly desired to become a writer. Thus, the two like-minded individuals quickly formed a successful union, raising their child together. However, their idyllic life lasted only until their son turned 4. On a day when Samuel was supposed to pick up their son, he became engrossed in his writing, and instead, he sent a nanny. As a result, their son was hit by a motorcycle, suffering permanent damage to his visual nerves. Samuel felt intense guilt, filled with a sense of wrongdoing, and they spent a whole year by their son's side in the hospital. To make amends, Samuel kept their son from going to school due to fears of discrimination, resigned from his university position, and personally conducted lessons at home. However, troubles kept coming their way, and the family faced economic difficulties. Samuel was extremely anxious and fell into depression. In an effort to save money, he came up with the idea of returning to their hometown to cut expenses. The couple could be with their son while pursuing writing careers. In this manner, Sandra, a German city woman, followed Samuel to a remote part of France, managing an old, run-down inn without funds for renovations. As everyone spoke French here, Sandra found it challenging, and Samuel's condition remained one of guilt and anxiety. Soon after, the trial began, and the prosecutor delved deep during this time, attempting to condemn Sandra to hell from the start. Sandra is actually bisexual and recently had an incident of infidelity within the marriage. The female college student was summoned as a witness by the prosecutor, repeatedly questioning her if she was seduced by Sandra on the day of the incident. Fortunately, the student did not admit to it. She was there solely to seek literary advice from Sandra. However, the student mentioned separately that she felt she was driven away by Samuel that day. She distinctly sensed the increasingly loud music, indicating displeasure and eviction. The prosecutor immediately added that Samuel couldn't tolerate Sandra's affair under his nose, thus creating the noise. Sandra vehemently denied this, stating that Samuel simply loved listening to noisy music. The lawyer had no choice but to move on to the next phase of the debate. Based on the analysis of the 3 blood drops found on the side of the shed at the crime scene, the prosecution's forensic expert claimed that these long and narrow bloodstains were typical shapes created by splatter from a height. The victim must have suffered a head attack on the balcony of the 3rd floor and was then pushed down. However, the defense's forensic expert immediately countered, stating that it was impossible for a physically unfit woman to violently attack a man who was 182 centimeters tall and weighed 170 kilograms, and then push him over the railing. The most credible scenario was that the victim fell from the attic on the 4th floor. Due to the rebound force, 3 blood drops splattered onto the side of the shed. As for why there were no bloodstains on the shed roof, they explained that the blood would have melted due to the limited daylight hours during the snowy day. At the time of the incident, when the police arrived at the scene, the bloodstains on the shed roof had already been washed away by the melted snow and water. Both sides argued with valid reasoning, but it was still speculative, lacking irrefutable substantive evidence, as Sandra claimed that her husband suffered from depression triggered by their son's accident. Samuel had been taking antidepressants for a long time, but his depressive mood did not improve, especially after moving to the remote and impoverished countryside of France. Sandra's novels were continuously published, while Samuel's novels could barely get past the beginning. The psychological pressure was immense, and Samuel believed that his inability to focus was due to dependence on medication. Thus, he chose to stop taking antidepressants. Possibly due to the side effects of withdrawal, Sandra found her husband taking a large amount of aspirin 6 months prior in the early morning, indicating a suicide attempt. However, the prosecution brought in a psychologist who stated that Samuel couldn't be diagnosed with depression. He only showed a tendency toward it. The medication was a preventive measure, and quitting it wouldn't trigger suicide. The psychologist continued to point out that Samuel sought psychiatric help because he couldn't bear his wife's accusations. Sandra had placed all the blame for their son's accident on him, and she constantly reminded him that he had to pay the price for it. Sandra became infuriated. She had to interrupt the doctor, emphasizing that outsiders always saw just the tip of the iceberg, and only they knew the true situation. In this courtroom trial, Daniel, as a witness, observed the entire proceedings. Without this trial, he might never have known that his parents had so many hardships and secrets. Sandra was deeply concerned for her son. While she could convince herself not to care about others' judgments, she had to take Daniel's trust crisis seriously. Sandra gently addressed this concern with her son before bedtime.
I'm not that monster, you know? Everything you hear in the trial, it's just... it's twisted, you know? And it wasn't like that, you know. Your father was my soulmate. We chose each other, and I loved him.
The next day, the trial continued, and the judge allowed the prosecution to play the recording from the USB drive. In the recording, the couple had a heated argument. Samuel complained that he didn't have enough time for everything. He needed to renovate the guest house, teach their son, and find time to write novels. He felt he had sacrificed too much for the family and wanted Sandra to share some household responsibilities to help him achieve his dream of becoming a successful writer. Sandra argued that she was already doing everything she could. She balanced writing to earn money while also spending time with Daniel. According to her, Samuel's lack of time for writing was due to his stubbornness. Sandra suggested that if he dropped some unnecessary commitments, he would have plenty of time to write. She believed that having a child and managing household chores shouldn't hinder a writer. Sandra also pointed out that she had worked hard to move from her hometown in Germany to the big city of London. Now, she was in rural France with Samuel, all to alleviate his guilt. Samuel, emotionally charged, accused Sandra of taking advantage of him. He argued that their son was both of theirs, and if he didn't invest time in caring for their son, Sandra wouldn't have the luxury to focus on writing. Samuel claimed Sandra stole his best ideas for her successful book, ideas he had abandoned. However, Samuel's fear of writing due to continuous failures led him to blame Sandra for his predicament. Samuel had no words left, only continued complaints. He felt Sandra imposed her rhythm, time schedule, lifestyle, way of speaking, eating habits, and even their lovemaking style on him. Sandra countered, claiming it was a normal physiological need and Samuel had become less intimate since their son's accident. Sandra argued that those instances occurred out of extreme emotional needs. As they continued arguing, the former lovers spared no mercy, hurting each other profoundly. At this moment, they became each other's most hated individuals in the world. When Samuel went too far, stating that Sandra's promiscuous behavior not only harmed him but also their son, Sandra was thoroughly enraged. This very private recording was broadcasted live in court for a few minutes, leaving Sandra utterly exposed. In reality, anyone in her shoes would have faced the same scrutiny. After all, no one's life can withstand thorough examination. We are all humans with our own dirty little secrets, aren't we? For Daniel, the impact of this heated argument was immense. He never imagined his parents could engage in such a verbal brawl, let alone that the seemingly loving couple harbored such deep-seated resentment. People expected physical violence to follow such intense arguments, believing both parties would end up battered and bruised. However, Sandra claimed that Samuel only gripped her wrist forcefully, and in response, she slapped him in anger. Samuel then resorted to self-harm, punching the walls. She insisted that she wasn't physically harmed. However, the prosecutor continued to escalate the situation, asserting that this emotionally charged quarrel was a prelude to jealousy and a rehearsal for unintentional manslaughter the next day. Trials tend to interpret the actions of individuals with maximum malice. The prosecutor even brought up a book written by Sandra, as she frequently mentioned in interviews that her works drew inspiration from real-life experiences. This particular book depicted a female character contemplating killing her husband, with psychological descriptions matching Sandra's real-life motive for killing Samuel. Hence, Sandra might have harbored such intentions long before, a chilling allegation indeed. Fortunately, the judge emphasized evidence, acknowledging that while reasoning might suggest a certain narrative, without substantial proof, conviction was impossible. It ultimately led to the defense attorney presenting an imaginative interpretation. The lawyer urged everyone to empathize with Samuel's final state, a university professor facing financial ruin due to his son's accident, experiencing mental breakdowns, burning bridges to write novels only to realize he wasn't cut out for it. Meanwhile, he witnessed his wife's career flourishing. Samuel wasn't merely navigating marital strife, he was grappling with the collapse of his entire life. If Sandra had to be convicted, her only crime was achieving success in the domain where her husband had failed. The judge adjourns the court for the day, as it's a Friday. In the next court session on Monday, the judge plans to call Daniel to the witness stand because Daniel claims to have discovered new evidence. However, given the witness and the defendant's mother-son relationship, the judge decides to assign a guardian to stay with the witness over the weekend, monitoring Daniel closely and prohibiting him from discussing trial-related topics with anyone. Daniel, however, takes a harsher stance and directly requests his mother to leave, insisting that she only return home after the trial concludes. Sandra is deeply saddened. Tears stream down Sandra's face. However, Daniel's decision to send his mother away isn't driven by hatred. Rather, he wants to conduct an experiment. After his mother leaves, Daniel secretly feeds a dog a dose of aspirin, causing the dog to quickly lose consciousness. Fortunately, the guardian intervenes in time, saving the dog's life. Watching the dog vomit, containing traces of aspirin, Daniel recalls a day 6 months ago when the dog accidentally ingested his father's vomit and fell unconscious. It turns out his father's vomit contained a significant amount of aspirin. While this simple memory may not convince the judge, it's enough for Daniel to speculate that his father likely committed suicide. Strangely, after a day of trial, Daniel is unsure whether to believe his mother. During the proceedings, his mother's portrayal becomes increasingly frightening, leaving Daniel to seek guidance from the guardian. The guardian can only explain to Daniel that when we lack evidence and must judge a situation, the only thing we can do is to create a logically reasonable narrative based on our feelings and then make a decision. The public tendency, of course, is towards a theory of intentional murder because the scandal of a female writer killing her husband is more sensational than a university professor committing suicide due to depression. On Monday, as the trial resumes, Daniel recounts the experiment he conducted on the dog. Through this experiment, Daniel claims he cannot understand why his mother would kill his father but can completely imagine his father's suicide. However, the prosecutor feels that this line of thinking is not novel enough. Is it possible that the excessive aspirin wasn't used by Samuel for suicide but rather manipulated by Sandra? Otherwise, Samuel should have considered the vomiting factor. Daniel admits that he has considered this possibility, but he still can't understand why his mother would kill his father. Couldn't they just get a divorce? He believes that when lacking evidence and trying to understand how things happened, one must look at the higher dimension of why it happened. This is an irreversible cause and effect issue. Daniel's strong belief in his father's suicide is rooted in an unusual conversation he had with his father when they took the sick dog to the vet. His father said, "Dogs not only get sick, but they might also die. You need to be mentally prepared for it." Daniel now realizes that the dog his father was talking about was likely him. After sharing this highly subjective and touching story, the judge concludes that since there is not enough evidence to prove that Sandra committed murder, the presumption of innocence prevails. Facing the reporter's interviews, Sandra emotionally speaks into the camera, "I just want to call my son and go home." Daniel also states that he will be waiting for his mother to come home. However, later that night, Sandra and her lawyer continued drinking until the wee hours. She won the lawsuit, expecting some reward, but got nothing. Returning home under the influence, Daniel is already asleep, and Sandra carefully carries her son back to bed. Just then, Daniel suddenly says, "I'm afraid of you coming home." Sandra replies, "Me too."